Okay, I think it's working now. Just give me 2 seconds. Just got to make sure everything is here. All right. Um, so I just need to make sure the volume is working so that you guys can hear me. All right. Okay. Yeah. So the purpose with this particular stream is just to look at the question of whether Jesus was a Muslim or not, which obviously within the Islamic paradigm and what the Quran says, this is what Muslims will tell you, right? That Jesus was a Muslim. So I guess the first question would be that we would have to ask is, what do you mean by Muslim? Like, what's the Islamic definition of Muslim, right? Now, often they'll say something like, well, it's someone who submits their will to God. Well, that definition by default doesn't work, because I could tell you that as a Christian, I submit my will to God, but does that make me a Muslim? And they'd say, no, of course not. So obviously, there's more to it than just that. Okay, there's far more to it than that. I think the essence of what it means to be a Muslim is predominantly found in the Shahada, which is what Muslims say in order to become a Muslim. It's sort of like their rite of initiation into the Muslim faith. So to break it down, basically what a Muslim is it's someone who submits themselves to the God of the Quran, specifically the God of the Quran, whoever that God is. Again, I, as a Christian, I don't believe that God exists. I have no reason to believe that God exists. But if we grant them what they're saying here, effectively what it means to be a Muslim is someone who submits themselves to the God of the Quran. And then on top of that, they acknowledge the prophethood of Muhammad. Okay, so it's twofold. In other words, you cannot be a Muslim if you reject Muhammad as a prophet. It's as simple as that. So Muhammad is actually central or integral to one being a Muslim, which is problematic in and of itself, because, as a Christian, even as a non-Christian, there is very little in Muhammad or his example that's attractive in any sense to follow, because of the stuff that he did. But let's go with the Islamic paradigm here for a moment. What I would ask a Muslim, and I'll bring up a passage from the Quran to demonstrate this, and I'll share my screen, because I think this will make sense more so when you see it. So in chapter 2, verse 210 of the Quran tells us something about Allah, right? It tells us something about God. Well, the God of the Quran, rather. But the question is the thing that it says, and I'll share my screen and we can read it. I'm then going to ask the question, can someone say this about themselves and be a Muslim? So let's go to that passage. Let me just share my screen. And then I'll explain what the passage is saying, essentially. Share screen. Okay. I hope you guys can see that. So basically, the passage says this. This is from chapter 2, verse 210. It says, are they waiting for Allah himself to come to them in the shades of the clouds, along with the angels? If he did, then the matter would be settled at once, and to Allah all matters will be returned for judgment. So basically, according to the Quran, Allah, on the day of judgment, he's going to come on the clouds of heaven with his angels to judge the entire world. Now, my question to a Muslim then would be, can I say that about myself? Can I say that on the day of judgment, I will be coming on the clouds of heaven with my angels to judge the world and still be a Muslim? They would say, of course not. Absolutely not. That's shirk. Because you have assumed divinity for yourself, because you are doing something that only Allah can do, only God himself can do, right? Because according to the Quran, as I said, chapter 2, verse 210, on the day of judgment, Allah will be coming on the clouds of heaven with his angels to judge the entire world. Now, my question then would be, did Jesus ever say anything similar about himself? And if so, what's the implication of that? So let us go to Matthew 24. It's also in Matthew 25, 26, and it's also in Mark 14. It's in a number of places across the Gospels. But I'm going to share that now. So just bear with me 1 second. And as I said, guys, look, feel free to join, the stream at any point. I have the link there for anybody, whether Christian or Muslim, wants to join and just have a discussion over this stuff. If you want to try and prove your religion to me or whatever. As I said, I have zero reason to believe anything in Islam is true, because the case for Islam is sadly just that bad. It's illogical to be a Muslim, in my opinion, because when I look at the Quran, I have no reason to believe, first and foremost, it's Kalam Allah, that it's the speech of Allah. And the reason I say that is because I'm currently working through the Quran, and what I've noticed is that everything on every chapter that I've read so far is absolutely mediocre at best. Like, there's no depth to it. It's extremely shallow and repetitive, and it doesn't do anything. Like, it just does not stand out in any significant way as a literary piece, right? If you're going to tell me that this is the speech of God, like this is actually God's direct speech, I would have to elevate that, logically speaking, to a higher standard than any other literary text. But the issue is that when I do that, when I apply that logic to the Quran, it fails immediately, because it doesn't make sense to me that a text that you call Kalam Allah can't compare to non-prophetic texts. So I'll just give you an example of what I mean. Just standard literature. So if we take something like Dante's Divine Comedy, the first chapter in Dante's Divine Comedy is infinitely deeper and infinitely more revelatory than anything I've read in the Quran so far. And that was just written by a man. But you claim this is Kalam Allah. So in other words, because of that claim alone, it fails it for me, because I'm reading through it and I don't get any sense that it's from God. As I said, you can't justify this text being from God and then it being utterly baseless and shallow and the most mediocre piece of literature ever written. Like, one of the most mediocre pieces of literature ever written. You have to then come up with a justification for its utter mediocrity and how it can still be Kalam Allah in the face of the fact that it looks like it was written by, I don't know, a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old. Like, if you want to justify that, fine, but you're going to have to justify that for me in order to demonstrate to me that I should regard it as Kalam Allah in spite of the fact that it reads so poorly and it's so shallow and baseless. Sorry, guys, I'll be eating as we're doing this because I got food. But basically, the other thing I want to point out as well is that, and maybe we'll look at this towards the end of the stream, but the other reason I don't believe that the Quran is from God also has to do with the fact that the Quran makes historical errors, clear historical errors, like chapter 10, verse 90, when it says the Pharaoh drowned. No Egyptologist accepts that. No credible Egyptologist accepts that claim, because the mainstream view within Egyptology is that the Pharaoh at the time of Moses did not drown, because forensics have analyzed his body. We have his physical remains. Ramses II, he lived till the age of 90. And if you want to try and circumvent that fact by saying, well, he's not mentioned by name, well, guess what? We have most of the pharaohs from the 19th and 18th dynastic period, and none of them drowned. So there's your claim gone, based on that, that evidence alone. So, like, you have clear historical errors within the Quran, and I haven't even got into the, like, even the contradictions between the 7 Ahruf, for example, where there are actual contradictions between them. For example, in chapter 37, verse 12, in the Hafs version, it says Muhammad wonders, or you wonder, but the you being Muhammad. And then in the Caliph version and the Al-Duri version, it says I wonder, Allah wonders. So which is it? Does Muhammad wonder or Allah wonder? Clear contradiction. And that's just one example. I mean, there's contradictions where the meaning of the entire, like, again, that was a meaning change. That was a significant change to the point that it's an apparent contradiction. But there's even more stark contradictions than that between these 7 modes of recitation. Okay. So yeah, back to the point here. So as we've established, right? Chapter 2, verse 210. That's about Allah, right? So on the day of judgment, Allah is coming with the clouds of heaven to judge the entire world. Now, if I said this about myself, would I still be a Muslim if I claimed for myself something that Allah himself said he's going to do and that this is his prerogative? If I claim one of Allah's prerogatives for myself, am I still a Muslim, or am I committing a shirk by deifying myself? Well, you guys would say I'm committing shirk, right? Because I've deified myself in some sense. Well, let's go to Matthew 24 then and see what Jesus says about himself. So, listen to this. This is chapter 30. Sorry, this is verse 30 of chapter 24. So, this is what Jesus says. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, And if you read Matthew, you'll know that the Son of Man is referring to Jesus, since he uses it so many times self-referentially. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. Now, Matthew 25 then expands upon this, and so does 26, by telling us that the Son of Man will be the one judging, right? So in other words, Matthew 24, 25, 26, Jesus is saying about himself that on the day of judgment, he's going to be coming on the clouds of heaven with the angels to judge the entire world. Now, again, chapter 2, verse 210 of the Quran, what's it telling us? It's telling us that Allah on the day of judgment is coming in the clouds of heaven with his angels to judge the entire world. Now, my question then is, if Jesus claimed what's in chapter 2, verse 210 of the Quran about himself, which we clearly see from Matthew 24, 25, 26, it's also in Mark 14, can he still be regarded as Muslim? Right? If he's deifying himself in that way, if he's doing something that Allah said he'll do, and he's the one that has the prerogative to do that, since he is God. So in other words, if Jesus is doing things that according to the Quran only God does and will do from an eschatological perspective, is Jesus then still a Muslim? Of course not. You would tell me no, he's committing shirk by doing that, right? So this is part of my point. If you're going to sit there and say Jesus is a Muslim, well then how can you reconcile that with the fact that Jesus said stuff about himself that according to your Quran is specific only to God, right? It's stuff that's in relation to God and his deity, and the fact that God, according to the Quran, is the final cosmic judge, right? But if Jesus is claiming to be the final cosmic judge, then who's he claiming to be? And if he's deifying himself, can he still be a Muslim? Of course not. The point here is that Jesus' understanding of God was not Tawheed. Because if it was Tawheed, why is he attributing to himself things that should only be attributed to God? Like, again, the right to be that final cosmic judge, right? That's attributed only to God in the Quran, but yet Jesus attributes it to himself. If he was someone who professed Islam and was walking around as a Muslim, why is he claiming that? And on top of that, and I'm going to share this as well. Just give me 1 second. Now, this is 57 verse 3 of the Quran. Let me just share that now. Okay. Present. Share. Yeah, so essentially, in chapter 57, verse 3 of the Quran, right, Allah says that he is the first and the last, okay, the Alpha and the Omega. Now, the question is, does Jesus say anything similar about himself? Well, the quick answer is yes, because in Revelation 1:17, Jesus calls himself the Alpha and the Omega. Now, if I, as a so-called Muslim, was to call myself the first and the last openly and declare that I am the first and the last, am I still a Muslim, or have I committed shirk? Right? The answer is quite obvious. I've committed shirk by doing that, okay? Because you cannot, as a Muslim, again, as I established before, you cannot attribute to yourself titles or attributes of God, right? So if God, according to the Quran, according to chapter 57, verse 3, is the first and the last, and Jesus in Revelation 1:17 calls himself the first and the last, is he committing shirk? Of course. You would renounce him as a false prophet for saying that, right? So when you say, well, Jesus is a Muslim, well, it doesn't work. It just simply doesn't work, because in a number of places, quite clearly in Scripture, he deifies himself and he makes known his own divinity, right? So if I claim as a so-called Muslim to be equal with God, to share in the divinity of God, and to have that same divinity in full, so much so that I'll be the final cosmic judge, I've eternally existed, I'm the first and the last, and we'll get into another one in a minute where Jesus actually calls himself Al-Haq. It's like, if I claim those things about myself, am I still a Muslim? Of course not. So the simplistic view that you have, that, it's simply someone who submits themselves to God and then obviously professes Muhammad. Now, I know Jesus would be excluded from that since Muhammad didn't exist at the time of Jesus. But even going by your reductionist position of it's just merely someone who confesses Allah or whatever, it still doesn't work, because, as I said, Jesus did not preach Tawheed. Okay? So if we go to Quran 22:6. Oh, what am I doing? Yeah, Quran 22:6. Okay. I'm going to show you something as well. Okay. So this is chapter 22, verse 6 of the Quran. So here we're told that Allah alone is the truth. Okay? Now, if Allah alone is the truth, right? Now, the Arabic there is al-haq, for the truth. And it also says here, he gives life to the dead and he alone is most capable of everything. Now, out of interest, I'm just going to show you quickly what the following verse says. It says that Allah will surely resurrect those in their graves, right? So we're told here that Allah alone is the truth, okay? And he alone gives life to the dead, and he alone is most capable of everything. And certainly the hour is coming, there's no doubt about it, and Allah will surely resurrect those in their graves. Now, my question is that claim that Allah alone is the truth, did Jesus ever claim to be the truth? Well, yes, he did. In John 14:6, Jesus says, I am al-haq. Now, you can't rebuttal here and say, well, a prophet is the truth also, technically speaking. No, that's not what your Quran says. Your Quran says Allah alone is al-haq. So that when it says alone, it means he's the only truth, right? He is the truth. There's no truth besides Allah. Allah, it can be regarded as the truth and have the title al-haq because he is the truth. A prophet is not the truth. A prophet merely mediates God's truth, but since a prophet is not the source of that truth, then, as I said, they cannot be regarded in that way. Because, as I said, if Allah is the source of truth, then, or if God, rather, is the source of truth, then that makes God, in some sense, the truth, or the embodiment of all universal revelatory truth, whatever you want to call it, right? That's why he can assume and attribute that title to himself. A prophet can't do that because, as I said, a prophet only mediates God's truth to the people. But the prophet is not inherently the truth itself, since the prophet is not the source of truth. But when where I'm going with this is Jesus in John 14:6, he calls himself the truth, right? The way, the truth, and the life. But just focusing on the truth, right? He says, I am al-haq. I am the truth. Now, your Quran says, as I said, chapter 22, verse 6, Allah alone is the truth. Jesus is claiming to be the truth in John 14:6. If he's claiming to be the truth, can he still be a prophet? Of course not. Because he's claiming something about himself that, according to your Quran, is applied only to God. And if your Quran applies it only to God, to the exclusion of everyone else, because it's making known the divinity of Allah, and then Jesus then attributes it to himself, who's he claiming to be, right? So if he's deifying himself in that way, okay, if he's deifying himself in that way and making himself equal with God, how can you sit there and say he's a Muslim? Because is he not, by your own Quran, committing gross shirk by doing that? By assuming titles of Allah and attributes of Allah for himself? Of course. And furthermore, we're told that, and Allah will surely resurrect those in their graves. In John 11:25, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Meaning, and again, I can show you other passages where it says, the Son of Man will be the one that will be resurrecting on the day of judgment. But focusing in on Jesus calling himself the resurrection and the life, the point there is he's saying he's going to be the source of resurrection. He's going to be the one resurrecting. But your Quran says on the day of judgment, Allah will be the one resurrecting. But if Jesus claims in a number of places to be the source of resurrection, and he'll be the one resurrecting on the day of judgment, who's he claiming to be? Well, of course, it's God, right? It's a divine attribution. So, like, this is, this is something you guys have to contend with. So if you're going to sit there and say he's a Muslim, well, then prove it, because I've just shown you with a number of key texts from your own text that Jesus, in his own words, assumed for himself things that are specific only to Allah. And if he does that, how can you sit there and then try and convince or make a case for him being a Muslim? It just doesn't work. Unless you want to condemn Jesus and renounce him as a prophet. Feel free, by the way, guys, if you have anything, as I said, both Muslims and Christians are welcome on the stream. But if there's anything you want to come on and discuss, feel free to come on and we can go through it. But this is a point I try to get through, particularly to Muslims. Now, Muslims are sadly extremely deceptive people, just by nature, right? I mean, it would stand to reason given the one that they're following, right? But like, often what they'll do is, the way they'll package Islam is they'll package it kind of like a sales pitch, right? But it's a corrupt sales pitch, because it's as I said, it's a deceptive sales pitch that isn't founded on truth but found on total lies, right? They'll say something like, we follow the same prophets that you guys do, which is totally nonsense. That's a nonsense argument. And the reason it's a nonsense argument is because I can tell you what I believe prophethood to be. You can tell me what you believe prophethood to be. And then you'll see that when we define prophethood, they're totally different things within our own paradigms. So I'll give you an example. In the Christian sense, a prophet in the Old Testament, or all the prophets of the Old Testament, were literally there simply to mediate God's revelation to mankind. Now, the question is what was that revelation? Well, the revelation in the Christian paradigm was typological, meaning it was pointing towards a future fulfillment, right? So in a number of places, I think, for example, like Deuteronomy 18, in Ezekiel chapter 16, Zechariah chapter 12, number of places, and then also like obviously Isaiah in a number of places, like Isaiah 9, Isaiah 7, Isaiah 42, Isaiah 49, Isaiah 53, so on and so forth. There's a number of clear prophecies throughout the Old Testament. I mean, it even goes back to Genesis chapter 3. I mean, you can even take it back as far as there. But the point is that the revelation in the Old Testament is from a covenantal perspective. It's typological. Everything in the Old Testament is typological in some sense. So you have dual prophecies that take place throughout the Old Testament. They have an immediate application to them, but then they have a more important typological application to them through like this form of parallelism, right? Where certain figures or certain prophecies are paralleled in such a way that they open up for the possibility of a future fulfillment, right? Quite clearly, if you read them very carefully. So in the Old Testament, the consistent theme is that as God's people have strayed effectively from God and have been displaced from the kingdom, that God's entire salvation plan for them is to reconcile them to himself and to bring them to him, right? And to restore what was previously lost in Eden, okay? Which was the unity between God and man, right? As a consequence of what happens, there's disunity, and then the whole redemptive plan is to obviously go back to that unity that was previously there. And we're told that it will be, this is what the Old Testament makes quite clear, is that it will be fulfilled through a messianic figure. Now, that messianic Davidic figure that's spoken about in a number of places in the Old Testament is also deified in the Old Testament. Especially if you go to like Daniel chapter 7, you look at verses 13 to 15, right? So what I'm getting at here is that the whole purpose behind prophethood in the Old Testament was to mediate to people God's plan of salvation, right? Which was essentially as follows, that God himself will atone for the sins of mankind by entering into his own creation and resolving that disunity as a consequence of sin by doing away with sin. And then, as I said, restoring that order, right? That that unity, that harmony that was once there in Eden, bringing it back to that of, that total harmony between God and his creation. This is what it was. Now, my question is the prophets in the Quran, do they mediate that same message? You will tell me, of course they don't, right? Because you have a very different definition of what you regard a prophet to be. So, as I said, you have a different definition. And on top of that, the prophets in the Old Testament, I mean, even if we contrast them with the Quran, right? The funny thing is that, okay, yeah, they share the same name, but not the same character. Like, a simple question, right? According to the Quran, who did Abraham sacrifice? You'll tell me it's Ishmael, right? Well, in the biblical account, it's actually Isaac. Okay? And that's just one example. There's a ton of different examples. And the reason for that predominantly is because the Quran builds its biblical characters predominantly from apocryphal Jewish texts. So, for example, the story of Adam and Eve in the Quran, and then, with Iblis not prostrating himself before Adam and Eve, and then the sin, him causing them to sin in Jannah, by the way, according to the Quran, they were originally in heaven before being cast out of heaven. That's actually taken from a first century Jewish text called the Life of Adam and Eve. It's not even the original biblical account that we have in Genesis. It's something totally different. And that's a consistent theme with the Quran, is that the Quran seems to be borrowing extensively from these apocryphal Jewish and Christian sources, which is very strange and odd, because fortunately we actually have those originals and we can contrast the two. Like, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's chapter 32, verse 12. Oh no, 32 verse 11 rather, I think it is. Yes, 32 verse 11. So in chapter 32 verse 11 of the Quran, it mentions this angel of death figure. And if you look at the tafsirs on that, it tells us that angel of death figure is Azrael. Now, if you look into the etymology of Azrael, it's actually a figure that comes up in a 2nd century apocryphal Christian text called the Apocalypse of Peter, which was rejected as canon within the early church. Noticeably, like, strangely enough, it appears in the Quran, right? But in that original Apocalypse of Peter from the 2nd century, Jesus is actually referred to as my Lord and my God. Again, you wouldn't accept that, right? But notice what Muhammad did, right? He takes the angel of death figure from the Apocalypse of Peter, but then he redacts everything else, right? It's like, yeah, I'll take that, but I'm not going to take the part over here where Jesus is deified, right? Because obviously that wouldn't suit his theology. Now, the question would be, I guess it's an interesting thought experiment. It's like, well, why does Muhammad change the paradigm of prophethood and change the paradigm of who Jesus is, right? Because the Bible makes it very clear that Jesus was God in the flesh, okay? It makes it abundantly clear, right, throughout. Jesus was categorically, according to the Bible, absolutely not a Muslim. He was someone who deified himself by openly claiming to be God in the flesh, okay, by claiming to be Allah in the flesh. And not only that, he condemned Muhammad, by the way, because according to Jesus, the final prophet was John the Baptist, okay? There's no prophet after John the Baptist, right? Apart from Jesus, there's no such thing. But yet you guys believe that Muhammad is a prophet after Jesus. Now the question would be, why does that happen, right? Why do you think Muhammad may have redacted these things, right? Well, I think the simple answer is that because he needed to be a prophet for his own religion and for his own self-gain, by the way. Well, what do, right? If the whole notion of prophethood is cut off with Jesus and the divinity of Jesus, well, the only way to circumvent that is by taking away Jesus' divinity. It's like, if I take away Jesus' divinity and suggest that there is a continuation, a lineage after that point of prophethood, then I can then insert myself into the narrative, right? Which is what he effectively does. He takes away Jesus' divinity, and then he inserts himself into the lineage, right? Now, look, by the standard of the Bible, he's a grade A false prophet in every sense, right? There's no reason to believe in the prophethood of Muhammad for any reason. I mean, purely looking at him from a moral and ethical perspective, like the Old Testament prophets in a number of places were bad, but he makes them all look perfect in comparison. Like, that's how bad his example is. Because, you see, we look, as Christians, we believe that everyone is a prophet. Or sorry, not everyone's a prophet. Sorry, we believe that everyone is a sinner, right? Meaning everyone is a wicked sinner under God's wrath, in need of God's redemption, right? In need of God's salvation, right? So, because we believe that, we also apply it to the prophets. We do not believe that the prophets were sinless. Like, I know that this is something that's specific to Islam, that sinlessness is intrinsic to prophethood. We don't hold that view, because we view that every single prophet was inherently a sinner, because they share the same sinful nature that we all share as humanity, stemming from the same common origin. Then for that reason, we also believe that they were sinful, right? Now, the difference with our understanding of sinfulness is that in Islam, you believe that Allah makes you with a sinful nature, right, to test you or to tempt you, even though, by the way, that's satanic, because according to the Epistle of James, God doesn't tempt anyone, right? But in your Quran, your Allah is a tempter, because he implants in you these desires, these wicked desires, these sinful desires, in order to tempt you. Which, as I said, that's satanic. That's something. I mean, so one of Satan's names is the tempter, right? He tempts. He's the accuser. He's the father of lies. All these things. I find that quite funny, that a lot of the times, a lot of the titles that are attributed to Satan or Shaitan, whatever you guys want to call him, in the Bible, your Allah attributes to himself. It's very strange. Like the father of lies, Al-Macaron, he's the best of deceivers. So really, really strange stuff. But, the reason we don't accept Muhammad on any level, even putting the revelation, or whatever he calls revelation, even putting that aside, on a moral and ethical level, we again, reason alone will tell you that he's a horrible, horrible example in every sense. Like, this is a guy who, when he was cast out of Mecca and he was in Medina, he was raiding caravans. He was engaging in piracy. And then when he came back to Mecca, what was his example? It was one of total and utter subjugation and violence. He took over Mecca through violence, through subjugation, right? And then on top of that, this is a guy who, when he was insulted, he had people assassinated. He had them executed. For example, there were a number of Jewish poets who wrote satirical poems about him, and he had them assassinated. Like, again, Jesus in Matthew chapter 12, anyone who blasphemes my name will be forgiven. Muhammad, apparently, when anyone blasphemed his name, their head was taken off. And then that doesn't even get into the child marriage situation, the fact that the Quran condones in chapter 4 wife beating. You can beat your wife according to the Quran. And by the way, it does mean that, if you look at some of the tafsirs that make it very clear on that, which we can get into if someone wants to come on and discuss it. But then you also have in the Hadith, for example, Muhammad calling women inferior, Muhammad beating Aisha, Abu Bakr punching Aisha, the woman with the green spots coming to Muhammad, who was so severely beaten by her husband, and Muhammad just sitting there like a cartoon character going, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Like, this is the guy that you're elevating to the ultimate moral and ethical standard, and yet, he's not even remotely close. I mean, he actually more resembles some of the most tyrannical, wicked figures of history than anything good or moral. Like that's the thing that's rather, confusing. Now, I understand that from the Muslim perspective, that this is a lot of the stuff you guys don't hear about in the mosque, because he's kind of glorified in the mosque. But I'm telling you, go read your own hadith, go read your own literature, and you'll see stuff in there that's absolutely deplorable, and you won't be able to justify it. Your justification will end up being something, well, God chose him, so he gets to get away with stuff. Like, how does that make any sense? If you do something sinful, that's it. You've done something sinful. There's no workaround here. I mean, you also have instances in the Quran where Muhammad has to pray for forgiveness. And then there's one particular tafsir where they give an example of that, which attributes it to chapter 80, verses 1 to 10, where, I don't know if you know this, but Muhammad basically abuses a blind man, right? He basically makes fun of him because he was trying to impress these rich Arabs. So in that context, Muhammad was okay with, as I said, making fun of this blind man, just to kind of appeal to other people. Like Jesus, according to your own Quran, heals the blind, whereas Muhammad makes fun of them. It's like, and yet you're choosing Muhammad over Jesus. Yeah, I suppose that's kind of the main points. I'll just be eating my food here. I'll wait if anyone wants to come on for a little bit and discuss any of these points. As I said, Christians and both Christians and Muslims are welcome to come on. And if you want to share something, feel free to share anything. Now, if you don't want to obviously, appear on stream or whatever, you can also just put a comment and I'll just reply to it. But I would like to have a discussion. So if people feel, as I said, you're more than welcome to come on and discuss any of these points. And again, I'm not saying this, I don't want you guys to feel like I'm bashing you or anything. I'm just telling you how I honestly feel. Like, my honest view is that the case for Islam is non-existent. Like, you have to, to be a Muslim, you just have to blindly follow everything that the Quran says without being able to question it. Because if you question anything in the Quran, you'll see very quickly it's total, there's no validity or veracity to any of it. Because it contradicts and it goes against the mainstream view in a lot of positions. And I've had discussions with Muslims, by the way, that will actually, they'll say something like history is nonsense. So, you have to devalue certain disciplines in order to support your Quran. What does that tell you? You have to devalue certain, such concrete evidences that exist in order to support your Quran. In other words, that's pure blind faith. What's the mainstream view on the crucifixion? What's the mainstream view on the crucifixion? Well, according to scholars, both secular and non-secular scholars, Jesus was. So if we go by the Christian scholars, and actually not even the Christian scholars, let's leave the Christian scholars. What are the atheists' view on it? Well, John Dominic Crossan and Bart Ehrman have both written extensively on this, and they both say in their respective works. These are atheists, by the way, right? Well, John Dominic Crossan is an agnostic, but Bart Ehrman is an atheist, okay? And both of them have said in their respective works that nearly all scholars in the field unanimously agree that Jesus was absolutely crucified. They regard it as a historical fact. That's how concrete the evidence is. But you as a Muslim won't accept that, right? Now, some of you will. I know there's some Muslims that do accept that Jesus was definitely on the cross. But the orthodox position currently is some form of substitution. I couldn't, as someone who goes to the evidence, I could never, ever in a million years accept that nonsense, because it means I would have to blindly disregard the best concrete evidence that we have, and there's an abundance of it. Hence the what's the word for it? Hence the agreement here, right? Hence the fact that, as I said, this is the majority view based on the evidence, and not only that, they regard it so concrete that they're willing to state it as a historical fact for them. So you would have to disregard all of that to just sit there and to accept what it says in Surah Al-Nisa, verse 157, if you're going by Ibn Kathir's tafsir on that. And by the way, one other point is, I know that for Muslims, Bart Ehrman is like one of their favorite paper kind of poster boys. But I'm not sure if you're aware, Bart Ehrman believes that Jesus, and he says this in his book, Jesus, prophet of the new millennium, or apocalyptic prophet of the new millennium. He says that Jesus referred to the Son of Man figure. Now, the Son of Man is a cosmic judge other than Allah. Now, if Jesus claimed that, you wouldn't accept it, but that's Bart Ehrman's expert view. Is he right? Because be consistent, right? If you're gonna use him as an authoritative figure to make your point, what about his other points? For example, and he says this in his interview with Apostate Prophet, he firmly believes Jesus never spoke about Muhammad. So in your Quran, in chapter 61, verse 6, it says that Jesus prophesied about the coming of Muhammad. Bart Ehrman disagrees with that totally. He says, no, never did that. And he says it in his interview with Apostate Prophet. Bart Ehrman also believes that the gospel writers, every one of them, believe Jesus is God. He says it in his interview with Muhammad Hijab. Okay? You know, Bart Ehrman also believes that Jesus did refer to himself as the Son of God. And he did believe that he was the Son of God in some sense. So my point is that, and he also said in his view, and he also said in his video with Apostate Prophet, that Islam, and he said this with Muhammad Hijab, so Islam is definitely not the truth. And on top of that, Jesus was, if you were to tell Jesus, like, if Jesus was to appear today, he basically said that Jesus would say he's not a Muslim. But would you agree with that? Of course you wouldn't. So if you're going to accept Bart Ehrman's views in regards to, let's say, textual variants, which, by the way, also applies to the Quran, because he believes the Quran is not perfectly preserved as well. So in the sense of the Quranic idea of preservation, or Bart Ehrman does not believe the Quran is the word of God, nor that it has been perfectly preserved, right? So if you're going to accept his views over here in regards to textual variants among New Testament manuscripts, then what about his views about the Quran and Muhammad, where he rejects and renounces all of it based on his expertise? Is he right for rejecting and renouncing both Muhammad and the Quran based on his expertise and the views that he has of Jesus, where he does believe that Jesus referred to the Son of Man figure, which for him, as I said, was a future cosmic judge? According to the Quran, who's the future cosmic judge? You'd say Allah, but according to Bart Ehrman, Jesus had someone other than Allah occupying that role of future cosmic judge. So which is it, guys? Is he still an authority now, or are you going to renounce him now? And funnily enough, when I bring up those points to Muslims, they'll throw Bart Ehrman immediately under the bus. So in other words, you'll use Bart Ehrman when he suits you, but then when he backfires on you totally, and he does, by the way, now all of a sudden he's not reliable. It's like, be consistent, guys. Okay, I think what we'll do now is, while I'm waiting, or at least giving some people a chance to come on if they want to come on, we'll quickly look at an encounter I had with a Muslim yesterday. And just to show you guys some of the... Now, he's an extreme case. I've spoken to Muslims as well that are not this intellectually dishonest. Because I know as a Muslim, you have to be intellectually dishonest. It's quite sad, you know. But he was an extreme case. Not all Muslims are like this. Quite a few are, but not all are. Some of them at least will acknowledge that Jesus in the Bible does deify himself. They'll be honest enough to admit that. And by the way, that's the critical view of all the Gospels, just in case you're wondering. And when I say critical view, I mean that that's shared among both Christians and atheists. This is the key point. Atheists are not biased. Bart Ehrman is not a biased source here. But Bart Ehrman firmly believes the four Gospel writers believe Jesus is God. Is he right? Okay, so I'll get up that video. I will quickly just listen into what the kind of main... Okay. And as I said, guys, feel free to come on the stream. You're more than welcome. I need to make sure that I'm sharing the sound. Okay. Okay, this should work.
John 14:6.
So where in the Quran does it say that this is true for Jesus?
Okay, let me
Because
tell you
if
what's
Allah
happening.
is Al-Haq, according to the Quran, and Jesus calls himself Al-Haq, he's claiming to be
Jesus
Allah.
in his time was the truthful one.
That's
Yeah,
not what
that's
it
not
is
what
saying,
it says.
right?
You
Oh,
can't. He's not saying the truthful one. You're adding into the text what isn't there. The
Al-Haq,
term
the truth.
Al-Haq means the truth.
Do you
Show
believe-
me, show me in the Quran a prophet calling themselves Al-Haq.
Because this is about
Answer the
Allah.
question.
There
And
is
it's about Allah, exactly. So
Thank you, sir.
according to the Quran, Allah alone, this is the wording of it in the Arabic, Allah alone is Al-Haq.
Yeah, so
Jesus in
but
John 14:6,
in Quran,
it says,
where
I
does
am
it
Al-Haq.
say that Allah is Jesus. That's what I'm asking you.
I mean,
Where
that's
is your
not our
bridge?
point.
That's not our
But
point.
let
The
me-
This
point
is the
is,
point
no,
you have
but
to get this point across to me.
it
Okay,
doesn't
let me
matter
answer you.
All
because
of these,
no.
you're very right. All of these are in the Quran. Allah is describing His qualities.
Okay, let me ask you this.
But where in the Quran does it say that this is a tribute to Jesus? Where in the Quran does it say, I am Lord
Yeah.
and I am also
Okay,
Jesus?
let me answer you. So what we are saying is, how do you know he's a man?
I don't.
Okay, generally, let me
Yeah.
general
Yeah.
consensus. A man is what he
Yeah,
has so and so chromosomes. He
Yeah.
has and you can see and tell he's a man. So what we are saying is,
Yeah.
if these are the titles of a God, which is Allah, and Jesus is claiming the same titles, put the
Where
two
are
and two
these,
together.
titles in the Bible.
I just gave it, John 14:6.
I can show you if you want. Everything is there.
See the first and the last? You agree that that's Allah, right?
That's
First and last. Revelation 1:17, Jesus calls
1:11.
himself the first and last.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll give you another one.
Okay.
So if we go to the cosmic judge passage, right? In
But what
chapter,
if these
let me
names
finish. Let me
were
finish.
given to
In
someone in other books. What would you
They
say?
were never
No
given
one
to anyone
has
in
it.
other books.
Exactly, that's my point.
Yeah.
You are saying that these are attributed to Jesus.
Yeah,
But
Jesus said it about himself.
Yeah, but I'm saying in the Quran, because you're saying that the Quran has saying that Jesus is the Lord, right? That's what your argument is.
No, that's not our argument.
No,
You're
we're
missing the
saying-
point. You're missing the argument.
Then you're fine. Then
No,
there
the point
no
is
debate.
Jesus called himself Allah in his own words. That's the point. So if Jesus called himself Allah in his own words, why do you have a problem with accepting Jesus as
Okay,
Allah?
let me ask you
Because
this
I'm
way.
asking this question.
No, you didn't answer. You didn't hear my.
So basically, before I continue with this, the main point that we were trying to demonstrate with the poster that we had is that basically you have titles in the Quran, and I kind of demonstrated this a little earlier with the examples that I gave. But those titles are attributed only to Allah. So like the truth, Al-Haq. When it says in chapter 57, verse 3, the first and the last, there's other stuff as well, right? The cosmic judge thing, all that sort of stuff. So when these attributes or these titles are attributed only to Allah, according to the Quran, then it means it's specific only to Allah. So if Jesus claims this stuff about himself, which he does in the Bible, then who's he claiming to be? If Jesus claims to be Al-Haq, if he claims to be the cosmic judge, if he claims to be the first and the last, all these things, if he claims to be the life and the resurrection, the one responsible for resurrection on the day of judgment, who's he claiming to be? Very, very obvious. It's very clear he was claiming to be God. He deified himself. So this was the point we were trying to get through to him. We were trying to show him that by the standard of his own Quran, right? If Jesus actually said the stuff that constitutes as divine claims, according to the Quran, by the standard of the Quran, then that makes him God by its own very standard. That's all we were trying to demonstrate. But he just, for some reason, he was so intellectually dishonest. He just didn't want to acknowledge anything. Now, a lot of Muslims are like this, sadly, right? And there's a lot of Muslims who know better, but they still decide to do this sort of spiel. Like, I would appreciate if Muslims were just honest and said something like, okay, yeah, we accept the fact the 4 gospel writers view Jesus as God. We accept that the God of the Bible is deified and that he does deify himself. But guess what? We don't believe the Bible was preserved. We don't believe that those claims, whatever. We don't believe that Jesus actually said those things. But we will grant you that the things that he does say are very clearly him deifying himself. If they were to be honest like that, it would just make the discussion, like, we could then move on to the next thing. But if you're going to sit there and be dishonest and say the gospel writers don't view Jesus as God, when they clearly do, that's a non-starter. It's just wasting everyone's time. But that's kind of where he was at. But yeah, we'll continue on.
Question. What was my question? What was my question? What was my
you are
question?
saying to me, why is Jesus basically saying?
No, that's not what I asked you. The question I asked you, I'll repeat it again, right? Is if Jesus called himself Allah, which he did in his own words, in a number of. You're not letting me finish the question. Let me finish the question. Let me finish the question. The question is if Jesus called himself Allah in a number of scriptures from the Bible, right, in his own words, why do you have a problem with accepting him as Allah?
But you see, he can say whatever he wants then in that case, can't he? But you need to prove to us that he's the God.
Because he says it. He says it. John 14:6.
His works prove
Revelation.
that he's God. His works.
Yeah, and on top of that, the cosmic judge passage, right?
But you can't use the Quran, because if it wasn't the Quran, then Allah would say, why is there a distinction between
But the
Allah
Quran
and
is not.
Jesus?
Yeah, but the Quran is not from God. This is the point.
Yeah, but it is.
No, that's your view. Because which came
Can you
first?
read this verse? Do you know Arabic?
No, I don't know.
Then I can't help it. Then.
Well, which came first?
Huh?
Which came first?
Allah,
So you're saying Allah is
Bible
Jesus?
or Quran? Which came first?
which is in its original form.
Bible.
How do you know that?
Because we have the manuscripts.
We have the
300 years
manuscripts.
after Jesus?
No.
No, we have the
No, we have the
manuscripts. We have the
manuscripts.
first century accounts.
Yeah.
Even if you lose all the
Who's
manuscripts.
written the Bible then?
The
What do you mean?
apostles, the followers of Jesus.
And where's the evidence that is actually from the apostles? And
We have the
this is what
manuscripts.
Jesus-
We have the
Jesus
manuscripts.
manuscripts.
We
yes.
have close to 6.
I have the same signs.
Yeah, but
as
that's-
the Quran.
The
Just because you have
titles-
manuscripts doesn't mean it's from God. My point
Exactly,
is.
that's the point.
Yeah.
Just because
So
you
how
have
do you prove?
manuscript,
How do you prove the Quran's from God then?
still preserved?
Bible still preserved?
No, it's not. It's
Yeah,
been
I just told.
So again, circular reasoning, right? Like, this was just so stupid. I mean, I'm like, this is the level of deception, right? My point was, what I was trying to suggest to him was, just because you have the manuscript and just because a text is well preserved does not mean it's from God. And then his response was there you go. And then he's like, how? And then I was like, okay. Now that we've established that, how do you prove the Quran is from God? Well, it's well preserved. We just established 2 seconds ago that just because you have the manuscripts and just because it's well preserved does not indicate whether it's from God or not. You have to then prove that. And he doesn't want to prove it. He just wants to go back to circular reasoning, because that also applies to the Bible. It's like, yeah, the Bible is also being perfectly preserved. So let's say hypothetically both texts have been perfectly or near perfectly preserved, okay? How do we then separate which one is from God and which one isn't? We then have to do an internal critique of both texts. Quran fails miserably when you do an internal critique. There's no logical reason to accept it. But this was the point I was making. So going back saying self-preservation or it was well preserved means nothing to me. That means absolutely squat to me. We have other ancient texts which have been perfectly preserved. It does not mean they're from God. You have to internally critique the text to come to some sort of logical conclusion as to whether it's possibly from a higher power or not. Right? With the limited faculties that we have. Right? If such a thing is inherently possible.
Told you the manuscript. Do you want me to show you how the Quran's been
This
changed?
is why we
All right.
don't accept it.
All right, I'll show you how the Quran's been changed.
yeah. Okay. What is one meaning?
One means like Allah.
So when you put them together, like you have 4 fingers, right? Attribute. You have eyes.
What I'm saying
Attribute.
to you is, you are
Yeah.
using the Quran
Yeah.
to prove that Jesus is the Lord.
Yeah. When a Muslim asks me, tell me how is Jesus God? I show you the same
Yeah.
titles he has, which Allah has.
Which is right.
Right.
Which is right. He said it's
That's right.
perfectly preserved, which is right.
Perfectly preserved.
Well, yeah, which is right.
So there's a lot of
Whether
problems.
they fought or were they killed.
Yeah, because-
Answer it. Which is right.
Like I said,
Contradiction.
I'm not
One
a
says they were fought, one says they were killed. That's the worst and a half. 7 modes of Quran. He
Right,
said it's
so
perfectly preserved. Which
My
one's right?
simple question to you is this.
Yeah.
Like I said,
Yeah.
I'm
Which
not a
one's right?
scholar.
Now, this is a reoccurring theme in this discussion that we had with him. He gets caught, he deflects, he doesn't want to answer the question. if you keep track of this conversation, you'll notice by the end of it, he did not address or answer a single question that we had. He deflected to a question which had nothing to do with what we were asking, and we still answered it for him, and we explained where we were coming from. He just wouldn't accept our answer. There's a difference between not accepting someone's answer and not answering a question, right? We did answer his question. He just wouldn't accept our answer. And then on top of that, when we were trying to have a back and forth, a dialogue with him, we asked him several questions. Like, we asked him a lot of questions. He just did not want to answer a single question. He kept going back to the same question that he already had answered at the very start of that conversation, which you're going to keep seeing. Now, what I showed him, I'm just going to get that just to show you guys. So this is chapter 3, verse 146 of the Quran. The Hafs version, okay, uses the word qatala. Qatala means fought. And it's, so the way it reads is, this is the Hafs version, and how many a prophet fought with whom were many worshippers of the Lord. So the Hafs version is telling us that the prophets, they fought. Okay, they fought, meaning they engaged in battle. They fought. The Warsh version changes the Arabic from qatala to qitilla. Qitilla. From qatala to qitilla. So there's a change. Now the question is, what does that change do to the word and the meaning? Well, the Hafs version, which says fought, if you translate qitilla, it means were killed. So it says, and how many prophets were killed? Now, remember, the Hafs version says, and how many prophets fought? The other one says, were killed. Which is it? Were they fighting or were they killed? Again, that's just one example. Now, there's worse examples than that. But my point is that if you're going to sit here and tell me this has been perfectly preserved, how can you tell me that when your 7 modes of recitation have meaning changes within them that cause clear contradictions? Like what? Like why do you want me to sit there and accept that when you have clear contradictions between the two? But that's just one example among several, right? As I said, again, this just demonstrates why the case for Islam is just so bad. For me personally, I'm giving you my honest opinion, guys. Don't play the victim card. Don't get upset. You know, you guys are well able to sit there and critique and make fun of other people because that's what your prophet did. By the way, because your Quran is full of insults directed towards different groups because your prophet was like that. He wasn't an upright figure. He was sitting there, you know, as I said, executing people that didn't agree with him and then insulting them in different ways. He calls, for example, Jews monkeys and pigs in the Quran. Yeah, like this is the guy that you're sitting there worshiping, the same guy who said women are inferior, beat women, you know, condone child marriage, by the way, and child rape, and this is the guy you want to follow. And then you want to impose him on me, like I'm going to sit there like, oh yeah, this is, alhamdulillah, this is a great example. This is a great figure to follow. It's like, guys, sorry, I just cannot follow someone like that. Anyway, we'll get back to the video. But this is what I'm trying to tell you guys is, like, just listen to what's going on. Listen to the arguments. Listen to what's being said, okay? Like, we're making very clear statements to this guy. Just doesn't want to address any of the questions. He's had his question answered like several times and he still wants to deflect to it. He wants us to, again, circular reasoning, right? He just wants to be repetitive. He wants to repeat the same thing to get away from what's actually being asked of him. And at the end, it's very funny. Like at the very end, I was like, can I ask you 3 questions and will you answer them? And then he said, oh, I have to go now, right? Because we called him out and not wanting to answer anything. But like, this is what I'm saying is that a lot of them are like this, but there are also a lot that are not. There's also a lot that actually will be willing to have proper conversations with you and won't be doing, won't be engaging in this level of intellectually dishonesty. I know that because they're following Muhammad, the example of Muhammad, Muhammad was deceptive. He was a liar, all these things, a wicked figure. So this is the example they're exemplifying, right? This is the person they're following and imitating. So it does not surprise me that they're behaving in this way. However, we have to be patient with them, right? We have to be patient with them, long-suffering, right? And hope that they listen to what's being said because we're talking about the truth here, right? We're talking about their salvation. We're not like Muslims. As Christians, we're not like Muslims. We have to love our enemies. And we have to bless those who curse us. And we have to wish only the best for them. It's not like Islam, where if you publicly renounce Islam, apostasy, boom, they want you dead. And they want you in hell, burning in hell, because their false satanic god revels in people being in hell and suffering. Like, that's satanic, by the way. The God of the Quran, he revels in the eternal damnation of people, which is not the Christian God. The Christian God desires that everyone be in heaven with him. And he does not revel in anyone being lost, right? Because he views everyone as his children, and he wants them to come and know him and to be saved through him. That's what he desires, that the entire world be saved through him. But with the Quranic stuff, it's just pure satanic. It's same with the Hadith and same with Muhammad. But again, we'll just continue with the video.
No, my simple question
it's fine,
is
it's fine.
You said perfectly preserved. I proved to you it's not perfectly preserved.
First of all, is answer this question. You're using the Quran, right?
Because it's not perfectly preserved.
Right,
Yeah.
wait, you're using the Quran. So if it's not perfectly preserved, you still believe in all this?
No, we're showing. We don't believe in all of it.
So
we're
you don't
showing.
believe in- okay,
what we're
fine,
showing is that
fine,
the
fine,
Quran
fine.
is not
So
from
I
God
want
and that it
to-
ripped from the Bible. That's what we're showing.
I want to just ask a simple question to you.
Do you want to deal with this contradiction first?
I want to ask my question first.
Okay.
So if you say that you're using basically the Quran to prove that Jesus is God,
Oh, from a clay bird.
by Quran, I'm saying to you is, if you're universally truthful, also tell me
Are true. It confirms them as true.
Yes.
Right? Meaning there's a.
question to you.
You want to?
By Quran, I'm saying to you is, if you're using this,
Yep.
I'm making your job a lot easier
Yeah.
for you, because my question to you is, you're using my book, yeah?
Yeah.
So using my book, also
Yeah.
tell me, because if it's universally truthful, also tell me, where in my book does it say that Jesus is?
Oh, yeah, I'll
Allah?
prove it to you. I'll prove it to you. Chapter 2, verse 89 says what does it say about the Quran? It bears witness that the Injil and the Torah are true. It confirms them as true.
Yes.
Right? Meaning there's a direct lineage from the Quran back to the
We agree
according
with
to your
that.
own Quran.
I agree with that.
No, you don't, because you don't want to accept John 14:6, where Jesus calls himself
I agree
Allah.
with that. But which
Well, then
Injil
accept
and,
that.
which Injil and Torah is he referring to?
The one of the Jews and the Christians at the time of Muhammad, which we have.
No, it doesn't say at the time of Muhammad.
Oh
Where
my
does it
God.
say that?
Who's he talking to in that passage?
It says it's about. Have you read the
Yes,
commentary?
yes.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
says the original Torah was true. We have no issue with that. The original Torah.
But which Torah is he referring
The
to?
original Injil was true as well.
Yeah, it is true.
Is that the
Yeah.
Injil and the Torah at the time of Muhammad?
No, because it's changed by then.
So what? How can the Quran confirm something that he doesn't have
See,
or they
if you're
don't know
telling
about?
me
What are you
Muhammad
talking
is
about?
confirming a false or corrupted book, that makes Muhammad a false prophet.
Yeah,
It
is
says
the Quran
Muhammad
confirming
is
false truth?
The original.
Yeah, that was kind of a funny. Like, again, I know the guy is getting kind of demolished here in terms of, but then again, his reasoning is just so bad and weak. But yeah, like the point that he started off the statement by saying something like, well, if you believe the Quran is universally true, we don't. This is the thing. The Quran is not from God. I established this so many times throughout the conversation. The purpose behind that was not that we believe the Quran is from God, it's not that we believe the Quran is from God. We don't. We categorically believe the Quran is of a man, and a very ignorant man at that. Very clearly, if you just go through it. It's not that. It's that we're using the Quran to show that by its own standard of what constitutes as God, that Jesus is God because of the stuff that he claimed about himself, which commensurates perfectly with what you have in the Quran. That's it. That was the point. But again, the guy just did not seem to grasp it. As far as chapter 2, verse 89 in the Quran, it says the Quran bears witness that the Injil and the Torah are true. Now, this is a problem for Muslims, this particular passage, because there's a lot of debate, even amidst Islamic scholarship, as to what that actually means, right? And what's being referred to there. Because it is suggested that more than likely Muhammad is addressing the Injil and the Torah that he has access to at his time. So the Jews and the Christians of his time. Now, the thing is, if you go with that, you're kind of done for, because we actually have manuscripts complete. By the way, we have complete Bibles before the time of Muhammad. So, again, it's problematic. It's extremely problematic. And like, if that's what that verse means, well, then you're kind of done for. But then if you want to go down the route and suggest that, okay, the Torah and the Bible were corrupted and this is what he's getting at, well, then it doesn't work, because he's saying that the Quran bears witness that they're true. If they're false, Why are you bearing witness that something false is true? That's a contradiction in and of itself. And you can't bear witness to something that simply does not, no longer exists. Because if it no longer exists, then what are you bearing witness to then? You're bearing witness to something we don't have and something we can't confirm. It's a pointless statement. So the whole thing makes zero sense. The best sense of that passage is that he's addressing the Jews and the Christians of his time, and he's suggesting that what they have is in fact true, and that it commensurates with the Quran because they're all in some sense God's revelation. But if he's claiming that, then he's done for, because we, as I said, we have the Bible, like we have the Old and New Testament, the Tanakh and the New Testament before the time of Muhammad, complete. If you want to go to the Tanakh, we have a complete Tanakh from like the 2nd century, 3rd century BC with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then as far as the New Testament is concerned, as I said, we have a complete New Testament before the time of Muhammad, right? So whatever group he's addressing in that statement, we have it. We have it perfectly intact. So you're kind of done for at that point. But yeah, we can watch for another bit.
That came down. This was
Yeah.
true.
See, did Allah say in the Quran?
But what Quran? What Injil? What
my own
Quran?
book? You prove to me where it says.
I gave you one proof just now.
You're not even listening to the arguments,
I'm
man.
asking for a direct quote.
You're just ignoring the
I'm
arguments.
listening to you, but I'm asking you. Tell me where in the Quran directly it says Allah says I am Jesus. Because you are saying all these are to do with.
I'll explain it one last time. I'm going to explain it one last time. Please listen. Please listen this time.
I'm asking for a direct quote. That's what I'm asking.
I'm giving it to you right now, right? I'm giving it to you right now.
For that,
right? Before you do that, right? Again, just listen to what I say. Please don't interrupt this time, okay? As I said, we have Jesus's own words, right? His own recorded words by his own disciples.
Let's for the same argument agree with that.
Yeah, let's agree with that. Would you agree with me that if the Quran says in chapter 22, verse 6, that Allah alone is Al-Haq, and Jesus in John 14:6 says, I am Al-Haq, that would be a divine claim, yes or no?
If I say I am also one, does that make me a divine person?
You're not listening to the point.
I am listening.
If Jesus said, if Jesus calls himself, if Jesus calls himself Al-Haq, and according to your Quran, only Allah is Al-Haq, who's he claiming to be?
He's not claiming to be anyone. He was just saying, I am.
Oh my gosh. We'll try again. We'll try one last time. We'll try one last time. We'll try one last time. Relax. We'll try one last time. Quran chapter 22 verse 6 says Allah alone is Al-Haq, meaning only Allah is Al-Haq, yeah? Jesus says in John 14:6, I am Al-Haq.
Yeah, okay.
Who's he claiming to be?
So what is the connection I am trying
Oh my
to ask
gosh.
you?
Okay.
Oh my God.
Do you believe the Bible?
I believe that was.
Yeah, I mean, Muslim logic for you. Aye. Again, this is what happens. This is what happens when you invest fully in a religion that's illogical and requires nothing but blind, irrational faith. That's what Islam is. It's a blind, irrational, dangerous ideology. And this is the fruits of it. Now, I know we're only having a discussion, but there's other fruits to Islam as well, which also come about as a consequence of what Muhammad taught. Like Muhammad, in terms of the 6th secret pillar of Islam, jihad, jihad, right? What's the whole premise of jihad, Muslim guys, Mohammedans? Right? It's for you to go into territories and take them over by violence in order to expand your religion, right? Alhamdulillah, right? Go in and subjugate everyone, kill everyone that gets in your way. That's what Muhammad taught. That was his example. Now, a lot of Muslims don't do that, believe it or not. So ironically, they're actually going against their own faith. But if they were a true Muslim in the sense of the word and in terms of what it means to actually follow Muhammad, then they should be doing that. Now, do we want them doing that? Absolutely not. We want a peaceful world. We want a world where there's freedom of expression, freedom of religion, right? Now, when I say that, I'm not saying, but I don't want people to think that I'm accepting or tolerating lies or other religions. That's not what I'm saying. There's a difference between tolerating and accepting, okay? So I can tolerate you accepting a lie, right? In terms of if you want to follow a false religion, I'm not going to subjugate you to follow Christianity because I'm not allowed to do that as a Christian. I'm not allowed to exert violence in any shape or form because Christ Jesus was as a figure was a pacifist. He was completely against violence, right? And he what's the word for it? He prohibits it, totally prohibits it for us as Christians, right? So, for example, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Peter cuts off the Roman soldier's ear, Jesus tells him and rebukes him and says, look, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. In the Beatitudes, Jesus says, it was said to you before, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But rather I say, if one strike thee on thy right cheek, present them with the left. And then he'll also say something like, we're here to plant seeds, not to burn bridges. These sort of things, right? So the premise here is that Christ was totally against violence, and his historical example testifies to that, because he was a non-retaliative figure. So because of that, that's part of the mantra that we adopt. So when Jesus tells us to love our enemies, to bless those who curse us, we have to do that as Christians. Now, as Muslims, you don't have to do that, because that's not the example of Muhammad. Since Muhammad did call you to implement violence, did call you to violently subjugate people, right? That was the example of Muhammad. He was a violent warlord. And that's, what you're called to do as a Muslim. Now, ironically, as I said, most Muslims, not most, but a lot of Muslims don't do that. And the reason is because their spirit tells them that that's not good. It's not good to do that. But, this is the thing, guys, is that if your spirit is telling you that this sort of behavior is irreprehensible, that, these behaviors of Muhammad, then why do you follow the guy? If there's clearly things that you disagree that he did, and you don't accept, then why are you following him blindly? Because at the end of the day, your Quran says he's the ultimate moral and ethical example, and you are to follow him in every sense. But yet you guys reject certain things that he did, and you actually say that he was not right for doing them, right? So, for example, when he had the Jewish poets executed, like when Muhammad had people executed merely for insulting him, is that right? Well, a lot of you would tell me, no, he wasn't right in doing that. He shouldn't have done that. But yet he did do that. The same thing with Muhammad saying women are inferior. Is that right? Is it right that women are inferior? Is Muhammad right when he says that? You guys would tell me, no, that's absolutely not true. Women are on equal footing with men. Of course they are. The equality between men and women is what we should all strive for. But Islam does not strive for equality between men and women. Women are inferior to men within Islam. Like, that's your ideology. But that's satanic. That's absolutely satanic. And it goes against the grain of the biblical message, right? If I'm not mistaken, I think it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 where, Paul, or is it 1 Corinthians? I can't remember, but it's the passage where he basically says, there's neither man nor woman nor Gentile nor Jew, right? And the point in that is that within, or at least before God, he views us all equally, right? And he gives us all equal value and weight. And we're all worthy of his love, and to experience him, right? And he values us all in the same sense, right? So, but the question is that what you have in Islam? Well, no, because according to the Quran, husbands can beat their wives. Again, you cannot do that in the Christian paradigm. The Christian paradigm calls for husbands to love their wives and to treat them with respect and dignity. That's why a relationship is such a huge commitment. From the Christian perspective, it's such a huge a commitment, and it requires serious spiritual refinement on the part of both people, where you have to look to yourself and say, well, do I have these attributes as far as being loving, respectful, dignified, patient, all these things for that other person, because I am to honor them as I would honor God, right? Because God is the head of that relationship, and it's sacred, it's holy, it's something God has ordained. But again, in Islam, you don't have that. In Islam, women are subjugated to men, and husbands are allowed to beat their wives according to chapter 4, like utterly irreprehensible stuff. But my point here is that as a Christian, like, obviously my goal is that everybody comes to the truth. But there's a limit to what you can do with people. If they decide to continue to follow the lie, which again, everyone has free will, they can do that. I'm not going to force them to accept Christianity. I can't. I'm not allowed to do that, right? All I can do is pray for them and hope that they come to the truth. It's not like Islam, where if someone openly rejects Islam, you then want them killed, and you want to see them in hell suffering. Like, that's literally what Islam teaches. Like, your God revels in the punishment of sinners. Our God does not revel in it, right? Because he's merciful, he's loving, and he's compassionate. He wants everyone to come to salvation through him. right? And he calls us to love our worst enemies. What does the Quran say about your worst enemies and what you're supposed to do with them? Right? You have hadith, for example, that says that the sins of the Muslim will be placed upon the Jew and the Christian when they go to hell. So the suffering that you would have received, we receive for you as some form of substitutionary atonement. Right? This is a wicked, satanic God we're talking about here. He's going to punish us in your place so you get off scot-free. Like, how is that justice? But then again, this is what your satanic texts teach you. But as I said, my whole purpose here is to communicate the truth. And I can tolerate people following a lie if because they have free will. I'm never going to accept it. Like I'm not going to accept your lie, but I'll allow you to follow it because that's you've made that choice freely. I'll tell you, and I'll do the best of my with the best of my ability. I'll try to convince you of the truth. Again, there's a limit to what I can do because ultimately it's between you and God. But I will do the absolute most I can to serve you in such a way that the light may be shone, that you may see God for who He is, and that you may encounter God in some meaningful sense. But there's a limit to that, and if it doesn't happen, then I have to allow you to just follow that lie, and I have to tolerate it. I won't be happy with it, but I'll have to tolerate it. In Islam, that does not exist. You don't tolerate people like that. According to Islam, you have the rule of apostasy. If someone totally willfully goes against your religion and your prophet, your response, given your hadith and given the example of your false prophet, is to have that person killed. Right? Because Islam is not a religion of tolerance. That's the thing. Right? Anyway, we'll continue on with the video. So as I said, the premise here is that, like, the guy, again, it's circular reasoning at its finest. But yeah, like, as I said, I just want to point that out again, just quickly before we get into this. Like, this is, as I said, this is me doing my best, guys, to convince you of the truth, to serve you in such a way that you can see the truth. Like, because I know a lot of the stuff that I said, you guys, like, when you think about it, you're not happy with that. Like, you're not happy with the fact that Islam condones wife beating, right? That Islam views women as inferior. Like, there's no way your fitra is sitting there telling you that this stuff is okay. Like, look at, as I said, look at the Christian perspective on it. Like, God views, as I said, relationships are holy. You know, they're absolutely holy, and they're a gift that God has given us. This gift of companionship that God has given us to have that other person, but to love them in accordance with our love for God, right? To honor them in the way that we would honor God, right? With God being the head of that relationship. That's why for us, it's not, as I said, if you truly are following Christ and you want companionship like that, it's not just about going, and getting the person or the woman or whatever, the guy if you're a girl, but you have to look to yourself and you have to look at the things about yourself that are not so good, spiritually speaking, right? Because we all need spiritual refinement. We all need spiritual help from God. We all have areas that we're falling short in. And that's where we look to God to help us, to prepare us for that union, right? That beautiful union. As Jesus, puts it in Matthew chapter 19, where he quotes, he goes back to, I think it's Genesis chapter 3. Yeah, Genesis chapter 3, right? Which is that they become the one flesh, which is a beautiful, beautiful description of the unity between both people, but between a man and a woman, when they're so unified together that they can be regarded as one. And it's sort of symbolic of the unity of God inherently of himself, since, you have three persons who are unified by that one nature, that they can be regarded as one. It's a beautiful exemplification of that. But again, in Islam, you don't really have something like that, because how can you have that unity? How can you have that love when Muhammad is sitting there saying women are inferior, and you can kind of treat them as you like, you can treat them as trash? As I said, the God of the Bible does not say that. He says we are, both husbands and wives are to love each other and to treat each other with respect and dignity and patience and these sort of things. And ultimately to make God, as I said, God has to be the head of that relationship, right? The first thing for men and women in the context of that relationship is that, God comes first, right? That God is ultimately placed first, that you love the Lord your God with your heart, mind, and soul. That has to come first before anything. Anyway, so we'll get back to the video.
the Bible,
Do
the
you believe-
original Injil. I believe in the original Injil.
Okay, you
We
believe
are
the Old
Muslims, so
Testament, New Testament.
we will have this.
Okay, do you think it's wrong to worship Jesus?
We don't worship anyone but Allah.
Yeah, but we're
But Jesus called himself Allah,
I
so-
know you
Do you
worship.
think
We believe-
it's wrong? I know what you
we-
believe, but do you think it's wrong to
I
worship
don't have a,
Jesus?
so there's no thinking that if I already have a, you know, if I believe
Yeah,
this is
but
wrong, this is
based on
wrong.
the Bible, based on what the Bible says.
My question here is really simple.
Yeah.
I know
But
what
he
you're
answered-
saying.
No, you don't, because you won't even admit it. Okay, I'll give you one last one.
I am
The
saying
first,
very simply,
one second.
If I say I am also Al-Haq, does that mean I am God?
Can
This
you-
is my
Yeah,
point.
and
Can you-
let me elaborate on
This
that.
is my
So if
point.
Jesus,
Where is your
okay,
connecting this is
okay,
between that?
if you call yourself Al-Haq,
Yeah.
right, that makes you a false prophet. If Jesus called himself Al-Haq, is Jesus a false prophet? Yes or no?
But
Answer the
Yeah.
question. Is Jesus a false prophet?
if he says that-
Answer the
I-
question.
yeah,
You're
yeah.
skipping.
In
You're
that case,
dodging.
yes.
So Jesus is a false prophet.
In that
See,
instance,
he's
if you
admitting
say-
it. He
No,
gets it. He gets it.
no,
He's acknowledging it.
I do get it.
Yeah.
What
So
I'm
Jesus is
saying
a false prophet
no.
according to you. So you condemn Jesus as a prophet. Okay, thank you.
I'm saying to you is a very simple.
We have a Muslim who has just rejected Jesus as a prophet. Okay.
And you're asking where,
We have always been
And he's
right.
asking
It's
where,
fine.
and I'm giving it to him, and he doesn't want to
and
accept
you're
it.
asking where in the Bible
Yeah.
does it
I am.
says Jesus is
My
God.
point is really simple to you.
I mean, notice how he literally, you have a Muslim who just condemned Jesus as a prophet based on that statement. I mean, that's crazy, right? Because Jesus claimed something about himself that's specific only to God, now Jesus magically is a false prophet. You know? So yeah, I'm gonna leave it there because you know, there's not much more to show in the video of value. But basically, as I said, like, this is kind of the circular reasoning that you have to deal with at times. But be mindful of the fact that not all Muslims are like this. There are quite a few that will actually engage in an intellectually honest way. But yeah. And as I said, like, I'll stay back for another little bit on this to give people a chance to come on and to you know, if they want to have a discussion or whatever, like, you're more than welcome to come on and talk and go through. If you have anything you want to show me, we can go through it. That's totally fine as well. But yeah, like, as I said, I have no reason to believe in any sense that Jesus was a Muslim. It's as simple as that. The case for Islam is non-existent. Actually, you know what? While we're here, we'll quickly go to one of my favorite Quran passages because it's such a historical, blatant error. Again, putting aside the 7 roof contradicting each other. But now, before I show this, let me just stop. Before I show this, there's another contradiction, just in case people are wondering. It's in chapter 20, verse 85 of the Quran. And it refers to this figure called Al-Samiri. Now, Al-Samiri, according to the Quran, if you look at the tafsirs on that, he's a Samaritan. But the ironic thing is he's supposed to be a Samaritan at the time of Moses. Now, the thing is, or the question would be, well, were there Samaritans at the time of Moses, or is that just completely like a ahistorical claim? Well, based on the best evidence that we have from, like, archaeologists, historians, all that kind of stuff, just to give a few examples, we have, what's his name? Andrew Tobolsky has written on this. Adam Zertel has written on this. Adam Zertel is an archaeologist, by the way. And his book specifically deals with, because it has it in the title, the origin of the Samaritans. And then we also have the Encyclopedica Judaica, which is a scholarly work that was produced by historians, archaeologists, scholars in the field that deal with the origins and the history of Semitic people, including the Samaritans. And they all unanimously agree that the Samaritans did not emerge as a people until roughly the 8th century, until around that period. Now, the thing is, when did Moses live? Well, if you're familiar with your history, the most common date that's attributed to the life of Moses is roughly the 13th century, BC. we're talking BC here. So in other words, if the Samaritans didn't emerge until roughly the 8th century, Moses lived during the 13th century, that's a 500-year gap between the two. So the claim in the Quran in chapter 20, verse 85, that there were Samaritans at the time of Moses, historians, archaeologists, and scholars, they regard that as an ahistorical claim, that it's totally false, it's wrong, because it cannot be proven, right? Because the evidence tells us otherwise. So, yeah, I just want to point that out. Like, so you have a clear historical error that the Quran makes, which scholars agree is a historical error, and yet you want me to buy that it's the Kalam Allah. I mean, again, that doesn't even, take into account the fact that, as I said, I'm reading through it and it's all the most mediocre, baseless, like, literature I've ever read. I've read a lot of books, and it's down there as like one of the, most boring pieces of literature I've ever had to engage with. Ironically, the stuff the Quran rips from, like the apocryphal stuff, is infinitely more interesting than the Quran itself. Like, I always find that mind-boggling. I remember the Quran is supposed to be Kalam Allah, right? Supposed to be Kalam Allah, yet the stuff it's ripping from is like significantly more revelatory, significantly deeper, or whatever, significantly more insightful. But yeah, unless you want to, as I said, unless you guys want to come on and prove otherwise, like, prove to me it's Kalam Allah, right? Actually prove it. Don't just tell me it's Kalam Allah. Prove it, because as I said, I'm reading through it, and nothing suggests that it's Kalam Allah. Everything in it suggests that it was clearly written by a mediocre writer at best. So let's quickly look at this next verse. So this is Surah Yunus. Surah Al-Yunus as chapter. So it's Surah 10, Ayat 90. So I'm just going to quickly share that. So it says here, we brought the children of Israel across the sea. The Pharaoh and his soldiers pursued them unjustly and oppressively, but as Pharaoh was drowning, he cried out, I believe that there is no God except that in whom the children of Israel believe, and I am now one of those who submit. So, it says Pharaoh was drowning. Now in chapter 17 of the Quran, it says that we drowned him, referring to the Pharaoh. But it also says that in the tafsir for this, that the Pharaoh was drowned, right? So we're going to go to Ibn Kathir's tafsir. But just be mindful of what's going on here, right? So this particular passage clearly tells us that the Pharaoh drowned. And it's also in chapter 17. It says we drowned him, meaning God drowned the Pharaoh. But if you read that passage, chapter 10, verse 90, very carefully, what's the Pharaoh doing in that statement when he's trying to confess Allah as the only true God? He's taking a shahada. Now, does anyone know what happens as he tries to take a shahada? Well, according to Ibn Kathir, we're going to read it here now. So this is the Pharaoh speaking as he's drowning, right? I believe that none is the right to be worshipped but he, Allah, in whom the children of Israel believe, and I am now one of the Muslims. He believed at a time when he couldn't benefit from his faith. So when they saw our punishment, they said, we believe in Allah alone and reject all that used to associate with him as partners, that their faith could not avail them when they saw our punishment. Now, let's go down here. Watch this. This is Gabriel, by the way, speaking to Muhammad. Right? Listen to what Gabriel tells Muhammad. So the context here is that as Pharaoh was drowning, just for those who are wondering, as Pharaoh was drowning, he was trying to take a shahada. Gabriel, to prevent Pharaoh from taking Shahada, swoops on down, opens Pharaoh's mouth, and fills it with mud. Okay? So he opens his mouth, fills it with mud to kill him, to prevent him from repenting. Now, how do we know this? Because Gabriel, look at what Gabriel says. First and foremost, the funny thing about it is he actually brags about it to Muhammad. He's like, oh man, if only you could have seen me when I did this thing. I was so cool when I was doing it. Again, that's childish, by the way. It's like, what age are you, 10? Like, why are you there bragging about it? Like, you're supposed to be an angel, an angelic being, a being of higher intelligence than us, human beings, because you're in a higher position of exaltation than we are. Surely you're in a position also higher spiritual maturity than we are, but yet you're acting like a 5-year-old. You're bragging about what you did to Muhammad. But anyway, we'll put that aside. He says that he put him out into the Pharaoh, which is the Pharaoh, out of fear that the mercy would reach him. Oh, what mercy, Gabriel? That he would get into Jannah? So in other words, Gabriel was afraid that if Pharaoh was allowed to repent, he would get into heaven. And to prevent him from repenting, he swoops on down and kills him. Like, how is that not satanic? Explain to me how that's satanic. Surely if your God is a God of mercy and love, he would desire for people to be saved, even the worst possible individuals. Because at the end of the day, if we're all sinners by nature, then, like, you know, the fact that someone is now confessing him as God, surely that would cause him to rejoice. It's a stark contrast to the biblical message where Jesus will say something like, you know, there'll be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than 99 righteous who need no repentance. But yet here you have with Pharaoh, Pharaoh's trying to repent, and Gabriel is afraid that if he repents, he'll get into Jannah, so he kills him and prevents him from doing so. Like, how do you justify that? Because if your God is a God of mercy, the most merciful, as you call him, the most merciful one, as you guys call him, how is this an exemplification of his mercy? As I said, it's a stark contrast to the biblical message, because in Romans chapter 10, verse 9, and particularly in verse 14, where it quotes Isaiah, it'll say, anyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And that's not time specific, by the way. That's not time specific. It's not circumstantial. It's literally, if anyone genuinely confesses true faith, the Lord will save them. If they truly repent, he will save them. It doesn't matter where they are or what they're at or what's going on in their lives. If they genuinely in that moment confess him as their Lord and Savior, Jesus will save them. It's a promise. It's a surety. Now, with Allah, according to this and according to other verses, you could try to repent, and just like with Gabriel, Allah he might not want you to repent. You know, he might be like, no, you're getting the punishment you deserve. I want to punish you, so I'm sending you straight to Jannah, or straight to the hellfire, right? Straight to hell. So then he kills you. It's like, how is this just, guys? How is this an exemplification of a loving, merciful God when he literally relishes in stopping people from taking their shahada and then sending them to the hellfire so he can torment them and punish them? As I said, the whole indication you get from the Quran is that Allah revels in people being in the hellfire and them suffering. How on earth is that an exemplification of his mercy and his compassion and his love? As I said, the biblical message is very clear. Anyone who calls upon the name of God or of the Lord will be saved. But with you, it's like, with your religion and your faith, it's like, well, it's circumstantial. Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe he's just not feeling it. Doesn't matter if you call his name. He's going to find some way to stop you. Because, again, like, he just doesn't want you to be in Jannah. Like, that's so twisted, right? Like, as I said, the biblical message is God wants people to be with him in Jannah. So he does everything within his power to bring people to himself, right? So much so that he's willing to lay down his own life and overcome death so that they can be reunited with him forever. That's that level of self-sacrifice and servitude to others is like the ultimate exemplification of true, pure love. But then in the Christian or in the Islamic paradigm, just does not exist. You have a God who relishes in the punishment of people, so much so that he actually sends people to hell, and he's happy to do so. I mean, that's so twisted and satanic. But then again, this is your theology, guys. Haven't even got into the predestination stuff, but yeah, that's basically what I wanted to show. I'll just point out quickly, just so people know that I'm not making this up. So with the Pharaoh, with the Pharaoh situation, we have, as I said, pretty much all the bodies from the 19th and 18th dynastic period. None of the pharaohs drowned, right? Now, the most likely candidate that's agreed upon by most Egyptologists is Ramses II. But the point here is that based on the forensics of the bodies, because we have their physical remains and they've been extensively analyzed, none of them drowned. Your Quran claims that the pharaoh drowned. It's a historical error, guys. We have the physical remains. We have the concrete evidence in front of us. He did not drown. Your Quran says otherwise. Your Quran gets it wrong. That's it. If your Quran gets it wrong, and it does, what does that tell you about the Quran? Definitely not from God. Otherwise, what are you going to do? Are you going to suggest that your Allah made a mistake? Maybe he just had like a bit of a senile moment or something, and he forgot his Egyptian history momentarily. But to qualify the statement with actual expertise here, we have, for example, Bob Breyer, who is a credible Egyptologist. Another one is Peter Feynman, and then David A. Falk. These are all credible people in this field that have written extensively or commentated extensively on this material, on this stuff. And the unanimous view is that the pharaoh did not drown based on the forensics, since we have his physical remains. And this applies to nearly every pharaoh from the 19th and 18th dynastic period, meaning if we open up the time frame or the window of when Moses existed, it has to be at least one of those pharaohs, and none of them drowned. Yet your Quran says otherwise. For me, based on the evidence, the Quran makes a clear ahistorical claim. And if it's making a clear ahistorical claim, not just there, but also in chapter 20, verse 85, and that's not even getting into the other contradictions within it, the other internal errors within it, then there's no reason to believe that this text is from God. But yeah, I'll leave it there. As I said, next stream, if you guys want to come on, you're always welcome to come on and have a discussion. And yeah, I hope this was of benefit. Let it all be for the glory of God. Let it all be for the glory of Jesus. And that's the main driving force. That's the main motivation behind all of this. So that you may know that Jesus is Lord and Savior, and that He desires for you to know Him and to accept Him, because He has prepared in the kingdom of His Father a place for all of those who desire to be with Him forever alongside His Father. It's very, very clear, and it's a loving message, and it's simply that God does love you, and He has made that known, right? He has made it very clearly known through His own self-sacrifice, through His own service to all of humanity, where He went as far as He could go for each and every individual person. You do not have that in Islam, because Islam is not the truth, right? Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, guys, and as I said, I hope this was of value.